real pleasure for me to introduce Chris Clark. Chris works on something that's quite dear to my heart, which is the evolution of complex courtship displays. But he does it from the angle of looking at aeroacoustics and the capacity of the animals to make sonations, not vocal communication. He works on that a little bit, but the sound production by the tail feathers and wing feathers, and he focuses on hummingbirds. And he's traveled all over South and Central America studying the behavior and feather morphology and structure of the feathers, and uses wind tunnels to test the properties of these feathers and how they produce particular sounds. And it's really, really exciting stuff. How could you work on hummingbirds and not have it be exciting stuff? So anyway, we're looking forward to your talk.
Great. Well, thank you, Barney, and thank you everybody for coming. I know it's the day before Thanksgiving, but anyway, I've been looking forward to getting a chance to come out here and visit UCLA, in part because there are a number of parallels between my research program and Barney's. So, the title of my talk: Singing Feathers, Animal Aeroacoustics, and the Evolution of Complex Displays. What I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to skip through, sort of briefly, a couple different motifs or major research questions that I either have been working on in the recent past or am in the midst of at the moment. This is a new version of this talk. If I play a sound or something like that and you desperately want me to play it again, go ahead and interrupt me and ask me to play something again, because I've got a whole bunch of videos and a whole bunch of sound recordings here, and we'll be moving pretty quickly. And I don't have my timing worked down exactly. So we're going till 1 o'clock, is that right? Or 12:50? 12:50, okay. Excuse me. So my research broadly is interested in understanding the natural diversity we see in the world, and one major axis of this variation is the presence of weapons and ornaments in animals. When Darwin was first developing his idea of evolution by means of natural selection, weapons and ornaments at first posed a particular problem to him, because the survival value of these traits is not immediately clear. How the greatly elongated tail on a peacock, or how the eye stalks on the stock-eyed fly would aid in survival. If anything, these things should be a detriment to survival rather than a benefit. And like so many ideas in modern biology, the nucleus of the solution to this problem also was proposed by Darwin. The idea that these traits are not useful for survival, but that they are useful for reproduction. That females don't pick males at random, but rather some males are more appealing to them than others, and so you get the evolution of ornaments by which males try to appeal to females. And likewise, that in many systems, males may compete with each other over access to females, and so that weapons may evolve as a way of one male attacking or defeating another. And so I'm going to focus on the ornament side of this question and look at animal ornaments. The general model that we have in the literature of how you get an exaggerated or a greatly enlarged ornament, such as the examples I had on the previous slide, is that we have some sort of directional female preference. And I've deliberately put female preference inside of a black box here, because in my research, although I would love to know more about female preferences, in the hummingbird systems that I'm going to describe next, female preference looks like it's a hard thing to get at. In fact, if any of you have any ideas, I'd love to talk about it later. But in this talk, at least, we're going to assume that females have preferences for the ornaments that I'm showing, but I don't have any other insights into what females are doing beyond the idea that they must have preferences. And so the idea here is that exaggerated male ornaments arise as a result of female preference of some form. So in the literature, or when we think about exaggerated ornaments, it's typical to think about an exaggerated morphological ornament. So for example, many birds, such as many hummingbirds, have greatly elongated tail feathers. This particular individual, this is an Anis hummingbird with elongated tail feathers of the red-billed streamer tail put on it. So for my dissertation, I did things like fly hummingbirds in a wind tunnel to measure the energetic cost of flying with greatly elongated tail feathers. But I don't have time to talk about that today. Instead, what I want to do for now is think about what this would look like if the ornament in question is a behavior rather than morphology. In the literature or in animal behavior, The examples of an exaggerated ornament are almost all morphological, but I would suggest that behaviors can become exaggerated under directional female preferences as well. The difference is that whereas the evolution of exaggerated morphology, maybe if the female has a static preference, like she likes a larger male or male of a different shape or brighter, something about him that is constant or fixed. Whereas the way that an exaggerated behavior might arise is if a female has a preference for a male's velocity or acceleration or something more dynamic, something more interesting than simply a simple morphological ornament. And so my example of what I think of as a greatly exaggerated behavior, which is kind of the behavior that I studied that launched my current research program, is to think about the courtship displays of Anna's hummingbird. So for any of you that are birders, of course, I expect you know Anna's hummingbird already. You have them on campus here. They breed in the winter when the winter rains arrive in California. So they are starting to breed now. Males will be setting up courtship territories, defending them with vocal song against other birds. Males have a number of behaviors that they'll do in response to a female coming into a territory, but one behavior that they do when a female lands on a bush or a tree is the male will then ascend about 30 or 35 meters into the air and then dive, swooping past the female. And at the bottom of the dive, producing this sound. So here's a high-speed video of the dive. So the male's up here in the upper corner. He's flapping his wings to power himself towards the earth, accelerating faster than he would under gravity alone. Then as he approaches the bottom of the dive, he tucks his wings and then spreads them. And right here he's experiencing really high G-forces as he's pulling up at the bottom of the dive. Then he does something or other with his tail and then transitions to another behavior. Here's another video. It's kind of, is there a way to turn these lights down? Great, thank you. So he is right here. He is diving towards us. So here he is, again, diving and approaching the bottom of the dive. So I'm going to pause it. They have these bright iridescent heads, and from this angle you can see the iridescent feathers glowing on the top of his head. The reason for that is that this species does not dive in a random direction, but rather when a male is going to dive to something, he lines himself up and dives towards the sun, presumably to maximize reflectance off of his iridescent gorget. And this was really helpful from an experimental standpoint because it meant that when I took a stuffed mount of a hummingbird and put it out on a male's territory, I knew which direction to expect the male to come in and could be in the best place to put up the high-speed camera to get a video. And that's also, so I'm sitting there with the sun at my back, which is then why we have the iridescent reflection of the gorget showing up nicely in this video. The other thing that I'll mention, this is a stuffed mount of a female on a stick that I've simply taken and stuck onto a male's territorial perch. As is often the case with courtship displays or species that have we don't know hummingbirds have high reproductive skew, but they likely do because males don't provide any paternal care, and so males will ardently court anything that comes along onto their territory that might be a female. So along those lines, this mount, you can't really tell it in this video, but it did not look all that great. I would use the same mount over and over and over again. There was a tendency for males also to attack the mount or try to copulate with it, and often a wing would rip off, for example. She had a big bald spot on the back, and her head had come off a couple of times and had to be glued back on. And yet, here comes the male. And then, as I mentioned before, because the birds will dive in a predictable direction, what I could do is put a camera up perpendicular to the dive plane, as I've done here, and then measure the velocities and accelerations during the dive. So this green line up here is the overall speed. We can see the male hits his top speed as he's approaching the bottom of the dive right here. He's diving to the stuffed mount is right here. There's a microphone down in the bush. And I was doing this is during my PhD at UC Berkeley. So this is the city of San Francisco in the background across the San Francisco Bay from my field site. So anyway, so the dive in this species has a more or less a J-shaped trajectory, as we'll see here. Okay, and so this is my example of a relatively extreme behavior. And so with just a kind of a superficial description of the kinematics of the display, I cannot say that males are actually at their performance maximum, that they're at the peak that they could actually do during the dive. But what I can do is compare some simple metrics during these displays to other performances that people have measured. And for example, I would fly these birds in a wind tunnel as a part of some experiments that I'm not going to describe. And so I know their top speed in level flight. During the dive, they were going much faster than they could during ordinary level flight. So if we convert speed into body lengths per second, because of course larger organisms move faster simply because of their larger size. Anna's hummingbird, the top speed during the dive was about 27.1 meters per second. That's about 60 miles an hour. That's 400 body lengths per second. So among vertebrates, this is the fastest known length-specific speed attained by any animal, barely edging out the performance of barn swallows. In terms of accelerations, the accelerations at the bottom of the dive as the male is pulling up are substantial. So during ordinary maneuvers of larger birds, such as swallows or cockatoos, they'll hit up to a G. Gyrfalcon diving 1.5 Gs. Maneuvering insects or hummingbirds have higher accelerations due to allometry, so they can hit up to about 3 Gs. And this bird was hitting about 9 Gs at the bottom of the dive. So this too is impressive. It's a more extreme characteristic of the display than we see in other types of flight. And the final thing that I'll point out is that in terms of gymnastics, the reason why the iron cross is such a difficult maneuver is not just that this guy is holding up his body weight with his hands, but he's doing it at a lever arm between the center of mass and the point of support. So the torques on his shoulders are really high, and that's actually what makes the iron cross the most difficult maneuver. And yet at the same time, he's holding up a mere 1 G of his, basically statically holding up his own body weight. Hummingbird is doing much the same thing, but it's holding up 9 times its body weight here at the bottom of the dive. With a really crude anatomical model, I come up with an estimate of the torque on his pectoralis muscles results in a total force of about 1.2 newtons per muscle. I don't know that that's actually that's the maximum force the muscles can produce, but based on work done in Doug Altschuler's lab at UBC, trying to measure the actual maximum force production of these muscles, we know that 1.2 newtons is in the neighborhood of the maximum force they can produce. And so I'm holding this up as this dive behavior as an example of an extreme behavior that we can think about as being analogous to the greatly elongated tail of many birds or fish or some of those other morphological examples. But in this case, what's been exaggerated is not some mere morphology, it's a behavior. And so I propose that extreme displays like this are interesting for 2 reasons. One, so I got my PhD in a flight biomechanics lab, and understanding maximal performance, or at least extreme performance, is of interest to us because it reveals design constraints and reveals, for example, what are the limits to flight. And so in my lab, one angle of this that I study is simply understanding flight displays for the sake of understanding what are the biomechanical or functional morphology constraints on these animals, and are they pushing up against these constraints, and if so, by how much? And then the other side of this that's interesting is from an animal behavior perspective or from a behavioral ecology perspective, is to ask what information does such a display contain? Can females, for example, use a male's performance during the display to tell something about his flight performance ability? I'm certain that males vary. In the experiments I've done so far, I've often had issues distinguishing between true variation and measurement error. And so in the papers that I've published up until now, I've never made statements about individual variation, but it's got to be there. And so one thing that I have a graduate student now that's starting to study some related displays in another species of hummingbird in more detail, trying to understand both what are the performance limits that the birds are pushing up against, and then to look at individual variation. And as we expect, there is likely to be variation in a male's ability to perform these displays. So in locomotion, there are multiple ecological contexts where we expect extreme performance to be important. So fights are good examples where our organisms are expected to give it their all, or at least most of what they have. When you have individuals battling one-on-one, and there's going to be a winner and a loser based on performance. Attacks on agile prey or fleeing a swift predator are also ecological contexts where extreme performance is expected. This is the classic life-lunch paradox or paradigm where this lagomorph is fleeing for its very life, and it's expected. There's no expectation in this context that this animal will be trying to optimize energy savings or anything like that. It is expected to give everything it has to trying to escape this hawk. And so dynamic courtship displays fall into this category as well. And all 3 of these ecological paradigms have a number of things in common. For one, the behaviors are often short in duration. Not always. You sometimes can get fights that last a long time. There are some types of courtship displays that can go on for a long time, but more often they're short. Second, we have high fitness stakes riding on the outcome. So that it's a matter of life or death, Or perhaps in these courtship displays, it may be a matter of genetic life or genetic death, which male gets a mating and which male doesn't. And the final point that I'd make that's common between all of these is that performance is always relative. Whether the rabbit lives or dies depends on its performance relative to that of the bird. In a population of males all displaying to the same female, which one is the most attractive to the female likely is a matter of comparison of male A versus male B. So in all of these respects, or in most of these respects, these ecological contexts for extreme performance are similar to a human context, an analogy that I like to use, and that's of athletic events. And so in this talk, I'm going to use the example of the 100-meter dash. This is the famous photograph of Usain Bolt breaking the world record back in 2008 and just blowing out these other 9 guys in the race. One of the reasons why I like the 100-meter dash in particular is that this behavior takes about 10 seconds to perform, which is about the same amount of time it takes an Anna's hummingbird to perform one dive. And so again, performance is relative between the winner and the loser. It's a quick behavior. We expect that performance is somewhere near or at a maximum. The only possible difference between this human construct and these ecological ones is that I'm not willing to speculate on the fitness consequences of this to Usain Bolt. Okay, so a major question in behavioral ecology is what drives or maintains differences between individuals. Why would we have some individuals that have a more extreme form of the behavior than others, like the Usain Bolt, the winner or the loser, or the imagined, the likely differences between males in a population that are displaying. And modern behavioral ecology has a tendency to focus on costs, and what are the costs of these behaviors. Actual fitness costs of performing something like these behaviors are difficult to get at. The way we would measure these, of course, is in terms of reduced survival or reduced future reproduction. And so in behavioral ecology, we have a tendency to focus on proxies that are easier to measure, such as energetic costs, immune function, or some other quasi-arbitrary performance metric. I'm going to ignore the bottom 2 in this list and just focus on energetic costs. The origin of this next paper and this next project that I'm going to describe comes from, or actually first, here's a couple of examples of papers on sexual selection and communication arguing that there are high energetic costs to communication or to courtship displays. The origin of this next paper and this next argument comes from going to the animal behavior meetings and presenting some of the biomechanics and some of these hummingbird courtship displays, and having colleagues say to me, "Oh wow, that has to be really energetically costly, that these displays, they have to be showing off that it's about energy." And that, as coming out of a functional morphology and biomechanics lab, that made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. And so in pursuit of understanding where this misunderstanding or where this where the disagreement about what's going on here comes about, I went into the literature to look at how people are using the words energetic cost and what they might mean by that. And the simplest way to explain what I found is to bring up a question, which is, of these 2 behaviors, walking for an hour or sprinting hard for a minute, which human behavior has the higher energetic cost? It turns out it depends on which definition of energetic cost you're using. Some papers do it one way and some papers do it the other way. And so this led me to publish this paper, The Role of Power versus Energy in Courtship. What is the energetic cost of a courtship display? So the idea here is that when we're measuring animal performance, one way that we do it is by measuring the metabolic rate or the metabolic cost of a behavior, which is what we have on the y-axis here. And we do it for some period of time, which is what we have on the x-axis here. And so these 2 behaviors that I've raised of having a behavior such as sprinting or such as performing a courtship display is like this blue line where we go, the increase in metabolism between BMR and maximum metabolic rate, the animal gets close to, if not hitting, maximum metabolic rate, but the duration of the behavior is short. By contrast, walking for an hour is more like this behavior down here, where there is an increase in the metabolic rate. It's not all that great, but it lasts for a long time. These 2 behaviors are different. This one has higher maximum power, but this one consumes more energy. And so in our human example, a human sprinting for a minute has much higher maximum power output. The idea of sprinting implies you're running as hard as you can, and so depending on how you measure power, whether you measure the power of individual muscle or you measure the power of the whole animal, regardless of what power measurement you come up with, a person that is sprinting will have a higher maximum power output. whereas a person that walks for an hour expends more calories, expends more actual energy. And so looking at the literature, many papers that in the animal behavior literature asserting things like courtship displays or singing have high energetic costs have actually not measured the amount of energy used. They've measured the power output of the animal. As I hope this graph makes clear, energy and power are closely related to each other. One is the derivative of the other. And so in the physiological literature, sometimes people will switch between one and the other, not really worrying about the difference between the two. But what has happened is that, in my perspective, is that animal behaviorists have then misunderstood what is being measured when we measure the metabolic rate and come up with animals, or behaviors rather, that have high power output, but then asserted that there is high energy that is being used. My point here is that Usain Bolt does not use very much energy to run the 100-meter dash. And likewise, when I put things like these hummingbird displays into context of the bird's daily energy budget, I find a bout of display burns on the order of 1% of a male's daily energy budget. These displays don't expend all that much energy. But they are quite impressive. The power output is high. And so one of the things that I'm pursuing in my lab is a better understanding of what is it about the functional morphology of these animals that limits their performance. For example, is it muscle power output, or is it could also be the aerodynamic power output, which is the conversion, how well the wings can convert mechanical energy from the muscles into a change in the airflow around them. But regardless, the idea that's prevalent in the literature that energetic costs are what are driving many of these behaviors just makes absolute no sense to me, and I think is wrong, at least in most cases. And so basically, what I find is that there's both little evidence and little theoretical scope for brief displays, short displays, to have all that much energetic cost, no matter how impressive they are. And I think what's going on is that these displays are if we have to have an adaptive hypothesis, it's not about how much energy is being burned. It's that something else is being signaled, that displays such as these hummingbird dives may be subject to biomechanical constraints, and as such are serving as an index signal of a male's flight performance ability. Okay, I could talk about this a lot more, but instead what I'm going to do is move on, because I have several topics that I want to talk about. So the next major focus in my lab is a field that I'm calling animal air acoustics, or I'm calling my lab the Animal Air Acoustics Lab. And so what I want to do now is turn to this sound that was produced in the Anas hummingbird dive. So when I started doing experiments on Anas hummingbirds to try to measure what their velocities and accelerations were during the dive, I at the same time had been sitting in the lab running birds in wind tunnels and testing their tails, and so I was well aware that Anas hummingbirds had this subtle sexual dimorphism, that the outer two tail feathers in males were a slightly different shape and slightly stiffer than were the same feathers in females. I also had read a paper from 1940 written by a master's student who had been also at UC Berkeley, who suggested that the dive sound produced by Anas hummingbird was produced by these tail feathers rather than a vocalization. However, I don't know what happened to Rogers after he published this paper, but a few decades later, Luis Baptista, who was a major figure in bird bioacoustics, published this paper where they argued that the dive sound of the Anas hummingbird was vocal, that it was not made by the tail feathers. But neither side had experimental evidence in the form of testing a bird in the wild. What Rogers had done is he'd taken tail feathers and taped them to a stick and whipped it through the air and found that they made a sound similar to what the birds made. And so that was the evidence that he used, that it was the tail feathers that made the sound. Whereas Baptista and Matsui had looked at spectrograms of song, and song is obviously vocal, and found that the spectrograms of song were pretty similar to the dive sound. And so argued that if you have a bird making two sounds that sound similar, the likeliest explanation is that they're one and the same, that they're not two different forms. But at any rate, neither side had done the experimental manipulation of catching or getting a male to perform some dives, then manipulating his outer tail feathers and getting him to dive again and seeing if he could still produce the sound. So that's what I decided to do. So this is what they sound like before manipulation. Oops. And this is what they sound like after manipulation. So there's still some sound there as the bird shoots by at 60 miles an hour. But that chirp, that explosive squeak, is gone. And in fact, it was produced, among all my experimental treatments, it was produced nearly 100% of the time before manipulation. And if you manipulate the outer tail feather, it was produced 0% of the time after manipulation. If you instead manipulate this tail feather, the sound is affected, but it is not entirely removed. And if you manipulate this feather, there is no effect at all on this sound. So this experiment implies that the tail, and particularly the outer tail feather, has something to do with production of this sound. There are additional lines of evidence that I then turned to. One of which was, again, the same high-speed videos that I was using for the other study. Specifically, if the birds are making a sound with their tail, and it's a very short, brief sound, you'd expect there to be some sort of kinematic correlate to this sound. You'd expect them to abruptly spread their tail right at the same time the sound is being produced. And in fact, that's exactly what you see in the high-speed videos. That right here, as the male is passing over the cage, is when the sound is produced. He has his tail spread for 6/100ths of a second, and he's producing the sound for 5/100ths of a second. So there's a good correspondence in the duration of the sound also. And finally, if it really is the tail that's making the sound, and it's simply caused by airflow over the tail feathers, it should be possible to reproduce this sound in the lab, similar to what Rogers had done. And so that's exactly what I set out to do. So what we have here, this is a ultra high-speed video of a feather. I'm blowing air across the feather in this direction and have it backlit. So we're looking basically straight into an incandescent light bulb there. And as you can see, what's happening is that the feather is vibrating. This is what they sound like when you put them in a wind tunnel. And they will sit there and make sound for minutes on end. Because, of course, what the bird is doing is spreading and shutting its tail, whereas here I'm just deploying the feather into a wind tunnel and leaving it. And as a reminder, this is what the bird sounds like during the dive. Oops. So the frequency of sound the feather produces in the wind tunnel is almost exactly the same as the dive sound. So between these three lines of evidence that experimental manipulations remove or eliminate the bird's ability to make the sound in the wild, which suggests that the feathers are necessary for sound production, the kinematics are consistent, and I could reproduce the sound in the wind tunnel using just the outermost tail feathers, meaning the feathers are also sufficient to produce the sound. These three lines of evidence together indicate that it is the tail that is producing the sound and that it is not a vocalization. So when I got that result, up until that point, I did not have that much interest in sound. I was studying bird flight for my PhD. But this was cool enough that it became obvious I needed to follow up on it and pursue it a bit more. And so launched, as I said, the field that I'm calling animal aeroacoustics. The context here is that sound is an intrinsic byproduct of locomotion. And so in the case of flight in particular, flying animals have a number of aerodynamic mechanisms in play as they fly, and each of these mechanisms has some sort of aeroacoustic signature. So from a mechanistic side, part of what I'm doing in my lab is pursuing what are these aerodynamic mechanisms, and then what aeroacoustic signature do they lead to. With the experiments that I've done so far, it's largely been looking at the aerodynamic mechanism and then the ensuing sound. But one question that I have that I'm not sure if this is feasible or not, but I'm at least have it in mind, is it possible to turn this around and actually use the flight sounds of birds to tell us something about the aerodynamics of their flight? And then the other side of this is the evolution and ecology of these sounds. What functions do they have? How do they evolve? How do they interact with other aspects of avian life history? So in this, on the evolution side of things, one thing that I did, so in this clade, the males of every species have a unique tail morphology. In fact, the tail has been one of the main taxonomic characters used to identify different species. And so what I knew I had to do, and then lucked out and got an NSF grant and was able to do, was to go to Central and South America and get a bunch of these species, get recordings of their courtship displays, and get feather samples and take the feathers back and test them in the wind tunnel to see how they made sound. So I'll play a bunch of examples. What the birds are doing in most cases is, or in many cases, is they're mixing tail sounds, wing sounds, and also sometimes vocalizations. So we're going to hear more than just the sound produced by the tail here. So this is volcano hummingbird from Costa Rica. So that species makes a vocalization, and in the middle there's an that's made with the tail. I'll play that again. Here's the purple-throated woodstar from Colombia. Oops. So there they're making kind of this tearing sound with their tail feathers and a snapping sound that I suspect is snapping by the wings, similar to what manakins do. Here's Allen's hummingbird, which is a species we have here on campus. I'll talk more about that in a slide or two. Here's Calliope hummingbird. So these guys, the second sound, there's a high frequency sound that falls in pitch. That seems to be a vocalization. It's that bzz sound that's made with the tail feathers. Here's Black-chin hummingbird. This guy's going to be mixing a wing sound with the tail sound. So the bzz, bzz sounds are made with the wings, and the toot, 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 toot sound is what's made with the tail feathers. Okay, and so a big part of this is that the sounds that are produced are both a function of the behavior and the mechanics. So this is a volcano hummingbird, and you can see it's spreading its tail multiple times as it dives over the female in the cage, and which is what produces the pulses of tail sound. So I did a series of experiments using Doppler laser vibrometry in a wind tunnel. So basically, you mount individual tail feathers in the wind tunnel with a microphone nearby, and then use lasers to record the vibration of the feathers in order to look at structural differences between the feathers. And so one of the major findings, one of the major drivers of diversity of sounds produced in this clade comes from diversity in the mode of flutter of the feathers. So in all of these, the air is flowing from right to left across the feather. I call these two feathers on this side, I call these trailing vane modes because it's the trailing edge or trailing vane of the feather that's fluttering. Although as you can see between the two, the mode of vibration has a number of differences. I call this a tip mode, where it's the entire tip of the feather that oscillates. And these modes often have really high amplitude, at least on the feather itself. And then this is a really interesting one. This is a torsional mode of vibration caused by airflow. So in addition to differences in mode of flutter, there are also allometric differences. So here, for example, this Allen's hummingbird tail feather produces a much higher pitch than this Anna's hummingbird tail feather does. And that's in part driven by its smaller size. And I'm not going to talk too much about the mechanics of vibration or flutter of these feathers, other than to say what happens is that there's a critical velocity, U star. The bird has to exceed this critical velocity in order for flutter to set in. So this graph is on a log scale, and basically what's happening, right? You go from having vibrations that are minute and essentially produce no sound to all of a sudden the feather will jump and start vibrating when a critical airspeed is crossed. And then in many species, but not all, you get an increase in loudness of sound as you increase in airspeed, although in many cases the relationship is not linear over the entire range. There are also really cool feather-feather interactions. So in Anna's hummingbird, this is R5, the outer tail feather by itself in the wind tunnel. In this case, the air is flowing the other direction from left to right. This is its neighboring feather, R4 in the wind tunnel, which as you can see by itself flutters at a much lower frequency. But when the two are next to each other, so R4 is right behind, downstream from R5, R4 picks up the vibrations and vibrates at the same frequency as R5 and amplifies the loudness of the sound by about 12 decibels, at least in my lab experiments. So in other words, the presence of R4 greatly increases the loudness of sound that's produced. So in Allen's hummingbird, which again, this is the sound that they make, what's happening here is that there are multiple frequencies. So here we have a fundamental frequency and a series of harmonics. So here's a harmonic and here's a harmonic. But there's a second frequency right here that's not a harmonic of this fundamental frequency. And then there's a sideband frequency here and a sideband frequency right there. What it turns out happens is that they're producing two different sounds with two different tail feathers. When I test them in the wind tunnel, if I test just R3 by itself, I get the blue peak and all of these harmonics. If I test the R4 by itself, I get the red peak, which is this higher frequency right here. And when I test the two feathers side by side, I recover the blue peaks, I recover the red peak, and I also recover all these interaction frequencies between the two feathers. So this was interesting. I have no evidence that females care anything about these heterodyne frequencies. They're pretty faint. They're not present in some of the recordings. But what was interesting about this is that it demonstrates that these feathers obey rules that you expect classic oscillators to obey. That when you have two oscillators oscillating at different frequencies and they're coupled to each other, you get these interaction frequencies. So this was cool from a bioacoustic perspective. I have no reason to think that this is a mechanism that actually matters much to females or matters in an ecological context. In Calliope hummingbird, this is this species. The field experiments initially were puzzling. I was not finding that removing one pair of tail feathers had a striking effect on the dive sound the way that I had for some of the other species. What I eventually figured out is that it's all the feathers together that produce the sound. In the wind tunnel, a single feather by itself did not produce that sputtering sound in the dive sound, but when I put multiple feathers next to each other and got them to flutter, this is what happened. So the feathers have this torsional mode, and the torsional mode seems to facilitate the feathers hitting their neighboring feathers, and this is what then produces that buzzing sound bzz, that they produce in the dive. So this is not aeroelastic flutter by itself. This is aeroelastic flutter coupled to collisions between neighboring feathers that then produce the sound. Okay, on an ecological topic, some other fascinating patterns that occur in this clade are similarities between vocalizations and non-vocal sounds. So remember that Luis Baptista originally thought that Anna's hummingbird was producing its dive sound vocally, and the reason for that is that there's a chunk of the song that is spectrally fairly similar to the dive sound. The other reason, which he didn't state in his paper but did write down years later, was that there's an even better correspondence between the dive sound and the song of the sister species of Anna's hummingbird, the Costa's hummingbird. So I will play these two sounds for you. Here is the song, which is clearly a vocalization. And I should apologize for any of you that have lost your high frequency hearing. That's a very high pitched sound. Here is the dive sound that they produce when diving. The two are not exactly the same. There's that little blip that's in the middle of the song that's right here that's not present in the dive sound, but both of them are frequency sweeps that go up and down in frequency over approximately the same frequency range. They're both about 2.1 seconds long, and also you can't really see it very well, but both of them have a very faint frequency modulation up and down, which in the dive I think is caused by the wing beat frequency, and there's no special reason why that should be present in the song. So what seems to have happened, and so anyway, once I had this result from Anna's hummingbird that they're making sounds with their tail feathers rather than vocally, I then followed it up, and sure enough, the dive sound in Costa's hummingbird is made with tail feathers. So what's happened here is we have two closely related species that don't sound like each other very much, but each one has either a chunk of its song or its entire song matches the spectral properties of the dive sound pretty closely, even though the dive sound is made with feathers and the song is vocal. Since publishing this paper, I now have a couple more examples of this from birds in South America that I don't yet have nice spectrograms made up for. But within the bee hummingbirds, within this clade, it looks like there are at least 3 independent instances in which a mechanical sound and a vocalization within the same species have converged on each other or match each other. So in this paper, I speculated that the mechanism was something I called sexual sensory bias. This idea that females may have a preference for a particular sound that males are then perhaps cheating or at least matching by producing a second sound that has basically sounds the same as the sound that females are preferring. We can talk later. Since publishing this paper, a couple of people have pointed out that my hypothesis doesn't completely explain the pattern. If you have males evolve a second sexual signal that matches an initial sexual signal, you then don't expect both signals to coexist. You'd expect the first one to be lost. Whereas what's happening here is that it clearly is being maintained. So basically, in Calypti at least, the idea is that the ancestor would have had some sort of song and some sort of dive sound that match each other. And here they've diverged in form between the species, but maintain their similarity within a species. At any rate, if any of you have additional hypotheses or want to talk further about what might be going on to drive 2 completely different sounds to sound the same within an animal, I'd love to talk more. Let's see. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead. One major feature, I have another paper that I'm working on at the moment. I've tested feathers from a bunch of other kinds of birds in the wind tunnel to see if this mechanism of sound, aeroelastic flutter, is widespread. And what comes out is that, yes, it is widespread. Many birds, such as the tonal sounds that ducks produce when they fly, or mourning doves, or things like hornbills, the sounds that these birds produce during ordinary flight also look like they are produced by aeroelastic flutter. One thing that happens, flutter is simply an intrinsic property that flat, thin objects, stiff objects have when placed in fast-moving air. Any feather that I test in the wind tunnel can be made to flutter. And in a couple slides, I'll give some examples of birds that make these sounds during ordinary flight. I have no evidence that suggests in some cases that these sounds have function. Like I have no evidence that the sounds that goldeneyes produce in flight have a specific function. This could be just like your footsteps in the hallway, an incidental byproduct of locomotion. Okay, I don't have time to talk about this too much. This is the African broadbill. These guys, instead of producing sounds during a display directed at another individual, instead use a mechanical sound as a replacement for their vocal song. So this is what they do over and over and over again. Dozens or hundreds of times. So in 2011, my postdoc supervisor, Rick Prum, Alex Kershaw, who got his PhD here a few years ago, and I went to Uganda to try to figure out what the mechanism is. The short answer is that it's also flutter. It's of some of the inner wing feathers that flutter and together produce this klaxon-like sound. There are a number of other species that produce mechanical sounds, but the mechanism is not aeroelastic flutter. So I didn't find it to be flutter in every case that I tested it. So this is the lesser florican, a species that lives in India and does this as its way of broadcasting ownership of a territory. It's not producing the sound properly, but basically it's a knocking sound. When I tested their feathers in the wind tunnel, I was not able to reproduce that sound. I don't know what the mechanism is, but it does not seem to be that the mechanism was flutter. So here's an example of a bird that just produces sounds during ordinary flight. So I'm going to play the black and white cast hornbill. So that's an example. That's the sound they produce during ordinary flight. I have no evidence that that's actually a sonation or a communication sound. But what I think happens in taxa, especially taxa that have splayed outer wingtips like these guys, that since flutter is simply an intrinsic feature that feathers have, that birds that have splayed outer wingtips are prone to having flutter occur passively. And then this is something that once they are producing it as a passive byproduct of flight, selection can grab hold of it and change it into a communication signal and then modify the morphology to give the sound additional meaning. Okay, so with the last little bit of the talk, this is a project that I have that I'm working on at the moment. So in addition to the large dives that hummingbirds do, they also have a close-range display called a shuttle display. So here we have two different species performing a shuttle display to a female in captivity. And the main takeaway from these two videos is that I want you to notice there are a number of differences between the two in terms of the behaviors that they're performing in this display. So as a part of going to Central and South America and getting recordings of all these different species of hummingbirds in order to get their feathers and test them in the wind tunnel, I also got good descriptions and good videos of the displays that these birds do. And so I'm also interested in just how do complex innate behaviors evolve. So one of the models for how a new behavior can evolve is Tim Bergman's emancipation model, where you might start off with initially one behavior, a model behavior, such as grooming, that then undergoes a series of stages, the first one being displacement. So the animal might start using this behavior, grooming, at an inappropriate time, such as grooming in the middle of a fight. The next stage, he said, was ritualization, where grooming in the middle of a fight attains its own function and apart from self-cleaning. And so it's sending some signal to the other individual in the middle of an agonistic interaction. And then the final step, he said, is emancipation, where now this new behavior, this grooming during the fight, evolves in form, and so that it may not look much like the actual grooming behavior that it evolved out of. So this is his model of how a novel or how a new behavior may arise out of an old behavior, through basically a duplication and then a differentiation event. And so in thinking about how the courtship displays from hummingbirds evolve, I've been heavily influenced by this paper by Ed Scholes, or more than just this paper, but this paper in particular. What he did is he studied birds of paradise, 4 species, and what he did is he took their 4 the courtship displays that they would do and broke them up into modules, which is what he has inside of each of these colored boxes, in order to make basically an ethogram of the display behaviors, showing how they transition from one behavior to another. But in particular, what he did is he hypothesized that what was happening is that in many cases, individual modules were being duplicated as well as being moved around inside of the display. And that this is what was producing a large fraction of the complexity of the courtship displays of these 4 species. So for these shuttle displays, I'll show you, this is what an Allen's hummingbird shuttle display looks like in real time. So again, we've got a female in a cage. The male's going to perform a really brief display in the background. Okay, and he's producing a wing trill that has an accentuated form during this shuttle display. So here's what that display looks like in high-speed video. And so in particular, watch the wings. he goes right there. So now he's flapping normally, and then again right there. So basically what he does is he flaps normally and then occasionally has little bursts, like there was a really short one right there, and then a really good one is coming up right there. What I hope you can see what's happening is that the male is going from flapping his wings normally to then changing his wing kinematics so that one wing is actually flapping ahead of the other one. And that so I call this an alternate wing kinematics. This is associated with the production of the specialized wing sounds that they make during their displays. And so basically what I did is I took the videos and took the descriptions of courtship displays that I had and broke them into elements such as the presence of these alternate wing kinematics. Also the dives that they do, every single species has unique kinematics. Here are a couple high-speed videos of dives. So this is a wood star from Ecuador diving. The bird is right there. It comes back, okay, it's back in view. As it shoots by the perch, it then has its tail spread and then kind of flips on one side and then flips on another. This is the bee hummingbird from Cuba. So the male right here is ascending for a dive. He's ascending. This species ascends nearly straight up and then turns, and right here is descending. Lost from camera for a moment, but we'll catch up with him soon. So here he is descending almost straight down, and then towards the bottom of the dive, pulling up. And then similar to the species above, he also does these undulation behaviors where he goes from one side and then to the other and back again. And so basically what I've done is I've taken these displays and broken them up into a series of discrete and identifiable kinematic components. And the way that I'm thinking about these displays is that behavior, like much of the phenotype, has a hierarchy. So in animal behavior, a lot of the time we might think about the context for behavior. So this spaghetti of arrows represents the interactions between a male and a female, where the purple box, the shuttle display, and the color's not coming through on the second one, the dive display, B, are behaviors that are embedded in the middle of this bigger behavioral context. If we think about just these two displays, the shuttle display and the dive display, A and B, the actual chronology of the display is often a series of repeated units. So A gets repeated a whole bunch of times in a row, followed by B, at least in the species that I'm depicting here. Where this is a brief diagram of what a dive looks like in this species, and here's a brief diagram of the shuttle. And so it's using the terminology in animal behavior, the A and B are what people would call a fixed action pattern. These are kind of the independent units that the birds seem to be deciding how many of which they're going to include in a particular display. But we can go deeper still. We can go into what I'm calling modules, these components of the display. So AWK stands for alternate wing kinematics. So this is where the bird is doing something funny with its wings to produce sound. And what becomes clear by splitting up the behavior in this way and making these diagrams, so this is the shuttle display, one segment of it or one unit of it. I've only identified 3 individual modules here. Here's a dive that has a bunch of additional modules. One pattern is that inserted into the dive is a modified form of the shuttle display. So that's what this box is supposed to represent. Also, the alternate wing kinematics gets included both in the dive as well as in the shuttle display. And in the way that I'm imagining this, or the way that I'm diagramming it, you can have multiple behaviors present at once. If you have the tail doing something and the wings doing something else, behaviors can get repeated. And then if we zoom deeper still, as I've mentioned, my background is in flight biomechanics. In biomechanics, we mostly ignore behaviors that are really complex, like a flight display. We're interested more in like what the wings are doing at any one moment in flapping flight. And so within a module, we can then look at the alternate wing kinematics and start thinking about what is the stroke plane, or what is the wing beat frequency, or what is the angle of attack of the wings during this display. So in the field of biomechanics, we typically look at these really discrete and short and kind of fine scale motions of the animals. And so what basically my view of this is that currently there's quite a bit of work being done down here at this end of this continuum at how are behaviors like this performed. In animal behavior, we also have quite a bit at this level of what are discrete displays and then what are their context. And that it's this level right in between of looking at how brief motor patterns are related to each other within displays, that there doesn't seem to have been very much work, and that's where this project fits in. So plotting some of these behaviors onto the phylogeny reveals that some of them seem to evolve a whole bunch of times. So this behavior I'm calling waggling and ascent is present throughout a series of species in this clade. Others seem to evolve just once or twice. Or in this case, be ancestral and be lost a number of times. Others seem to evolve once or twice. I actually think this is one origination, and I don't completely believe in the molecular phylogeny in this one particular spot. As I've already alluded to, these modules can appear in multiple displays. So for example, the alternate wing kinematics, unfortunately my videos weren't working when I tested earlier, but basically the alternate wing kinematics that are present in the shuttle display of Allen's are also present in the dive. So what you would have seen in this video over here is this little bird in the background doing the same thing in the dive as seen in the shuttle. And what I think happens is that the displays can duplicate in divergent form, similar to Tinbergen's hypothesis, that specifically one species, the Allen's hummingbird, I hypothesized that the pendulum display, which is not seen in any other species in this clade, is simply a modified form of the dive. What's happened is that the dive is split from one into two and is now diverging, so we have two separate distinct displays. I have a graduate student that is going to pursue this hypothesis a bit further. What's really nice about this system is that there is a hybrid zone between a species that has the pendulum display, Allen's hummingbird, and Rufus hummingbird, which does not have the pendulum display. Hybrids that are in the hybrid zone in Northern California and Southern Oregon are variable in the elements that they include into their displays. And so I think by looking at the phenotypic and genetic diversity within this hybrid zone, there's a chance to get at more of the mechanistic underpinning of how does a new or how does a novel behavior arise. Okay. So what I've done in this talk is I've talked a little bit about my thoughts on extreme courtship displays, thinking about them as athletic events. I've then introduced the field that I'm calling animal aeroacoustics, this research program that I have studying how locomotion, particularly flight, how flight produces sound. I didn't mention it before. One of the things I'm doing at my lab at Riverside is I'm building an acoustic wind tunnel. All the wind tunnels I've used in the past have produced really high levels of background sound because they were not at all designed for acoustics experiments. And so this tunnel that I'm building at Riverside has a huge silencer between the fan and the motor in the working section, with the hope of having a much better apparatus for looking at how air flowing over wings and feathers produces sound. And finally, I'm getting into the evolution of complex behaviors and how do these displays evolve. With that, I think I've gone over my time a little bit, so I'll stop it there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Yes?
I have two comments and a question. My first comment is I do all my PhD research sitting in my car on a golf course, and many times I thought if there was ever a TV game show where you had to identify the sounds, I could recognize, so I knew the difference between pigeons and crows taking off just by the sounds of their flight. If I'm looking out the window in one direction or writing notes and looking down, I can tell the difference between crows flying fast, crows flying slow, crows taking off from the ground, pigeons doing similar behaviors just by the sounds of their feathers as they fly on the farm and go on.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, they totally can be used for, as you said, communication signals. My
Yeah.
second comment is in the situations, in contexts where the vocalizations are very similar to the sounds being produced by the male.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe females prefer males that can match the two.
Yes, so Barney and I were talking about that hypothesis and that possibility. I don't yet have a graduate student that wants to look into that into more detail. Well, actually, that's not completely true. I have
ways to possibly explain the convergence of the similarities.
Yes, yeah, that certainly is a strong contender for a hypothesis to explain that. There's also, and there's a number of possible experiments to do. One neat thing is that what the birds hear when they're diving is going to be different from what the female hears because of the Doppler shift. The male won't hear a Doppler shift, whereas the female will. And there are some subtle differences between the sounds that they sing and the dive sounds that I've recorded that are, the shift in frequency is similar to what the Doppler shift is. So an indirect line of evidence that possibly supports this hypothesis that you have. So I'm hoping at some point to find a graduate student that wants to do experiments on Costas hummingbirds and look at this match between the dive sound and the song. And actually, currently I have a graduate student that is going to try to raise baby Costas hummingbirds in isolation to look at song learning and start to look at how this song is developed, because hummingbirds are one of the groups of birds that have learned song, at least that's what the literature says, and I have every reason to believe that that's the case. And so one of the things that we may look at once we've done the initial set of experiments to get this going will be to look at if we play the dive sound to a baby hummingbird, will they sing the dive sound rather than singing the song, for instance, or other possible subtle manipulations to the sound that's produced or to the song, and see what we can get them to learn or what we can get them to reproduce.
And I just is it, and maybe this is a stupid question, but is it the case that what's going on the left side of the tail is the same as what's going on the right side of the tail, just mirror images, or is it possible, or actually, you know, any evidence they might be making two different sounds from their tail?
So sometimes in a sound recording, especially on a windy day, you do see two separate frequencies that are slightly offset from each other, implying that one side of the tail is producing a different frequency from the other side. I didn't really talk about it, but if you vary the orientation of the feathers or you vary the airspeed, that does cause a difference in frequency. And so there's every reason to think that, especially if there's a gust of wind and a bird has to maneuver while it's diving, that the aerodynamic conditions on the two sides of the tail will be slightly different. And then as I was mentioning to somebody this morning, there's one species, the Costas hummingbird, that only spreads half of its tail when it's diving. And so, and they do right-handed dives and left-handed dives, and they alternate between the two. So they'll do a right-handed dive and spread the right side of the tail, then do a left-handed dive on the other side of the female and spread the left side, and go back and forth between the two. I don't know why. At this point, it's yet another thing that makes Costas hummingbird a fascinating species that deserves more attention.
You showed some very nice high-speed videos of the feathers in the wind tunnel.
Yes.
I'm going to go in different modes, and I was wondering, do you ever see, under any conditions, a particular feather, say it was in a torsional mode, if you change some parameter like the speed, it goes into a different mode?
All the time. Yes.
That's
In fact,
what I would guess.
In fact, I even have examples of birds doing that in their dives. So Anna's hummingbird, so I'm certain that is a major way that these sounds evolve between species, because you have, I don't have a nice slide made up of it yet, but the different species produce sounds with different modes and with different tail feathers. There has to be some way to go from one mode to another. If I can find my spectrograms of Anna's hummingbird. Okay, these don't really show it. Okay, so this is the sound that's produced by the back edge of R5 right here. There's a little blip at about 1.2 kilohertz right here. It's pretty faint in most, such as this one. That's actually made by the tip of the tail feather. Specifically, if I put it in the wind tunnel and I change the orientation of the feather, over a range of angles, it'll be the back edge of the feather making sounds at 4 kilohertz. But under a certain angle, instead, the tip makes sounds at 1.2 kilohertz, which is what this sound is right here. So basically, this is where the bird is spreading its tail, and then this is where the bird is shutting its tail right here. And every now and then in a sound recording, this chunk of the sound can be pretty prominent. So what I think is happening there, given that I'm able to replicate it so easily in the wind tunnel, is that as the birds are spreading their tail to try to make this 4 kilohertz sound, but the feather is passing through this other mode of vibration on the way there and then on the way back. And I have, as I've said, I have every reason to think that happens over evolutionary time in this clade, and certainly I can get the feathers to produce lots of spurious modes of flutter in the wind tunnel. By spurious, what I mean is that the feather makes a sound in a particular way, and I have no evidence that sound is also produced by the actual bird that it's from. And so I don't know the maximum number of modes that a feather has, but it can be as high as 10 or so. So for example, so I called this a trailing vein mode, but actually there are multiple trailing vein modes. This is one where the back edge of the feather is more or less going up and down coherently, but you could imagine instead that you'd have a node in the middle where they're going out of phase from each other, or other more complex modes like that. And so there's actually a bunch of different ways that any given feather can flutter.
I have a physiological question and an evolutionary one.
Okay.
The physiological one is the hemodynamics
Yes.
of what goes on in these birds when they're making these dives at 9 Gs.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at what happens with human pilots.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
During high-speed maneuvers and on fighter planes and all this kind of thing, they'll pass out.
Yes.
And not only will they pass out because of the reduction in blood pressure and so on, but they'll go blind because they won't be able to see anything.
Yes.
Now, do you think? I mean, I understand that the technological challenges of monitoring the hemodynamics of a flying hummingbird during this performance are daunting, to put it mildly.
Yes.
So what do you think?
Well, based on allometry, this is probably, there's two answers to this. First, based on allometry, it's probably less of a problem to the hummingbirds than it is to a fighter pilot, because the change in blood pressure that causes problems and causes the blood to drain from the head is a function of the height of the fluid column. And so, for example, loading a fighter pilot, front to back produces far fewer problems than loading a fighter pilot from head to toe because of the axis. Hummingbirds are so much smaller that all their fluid columns are way shorter. And so I don't know what the maximum Gs I would calculate that they should be able to withstand just hemodynamically should be, but it's going to be way more than 9 Gs. 9 Gs is kind of the maximum for a fighter pilot for a human, and hummingbirds are, what is that, 1,000th of our size. And so should just based on calculations of blood pressure, should be able to take far higher accelerations.
Well, do you think their skin can be a G-suit?
I suppose that's possible. I guess I'm arguing that I don't think they'd even need a G-suit based on the short height of the fluid column. The other thing is that the duration of time when they're experiencing 9 Gs is fairly short. It takes a human about a second to pass out from 9 Gs of force, whereas the birds, the bottom of the dive, the entire bottom of the dive lasts less than a second. The period of time when they're experiencing Gs above about 6 or 7 Gs is about a third of a second total. And so even if you put a human through that maneuver, they probably would not pass out because there's not enough time for the blood to drain away from the head. So the 9 Gs is impressive in terms of kind of the mechanical performance of the animal, but whereas in humans that's a major limitation because of, as you've said, the hemodynamics. I don't think the birds are under similar structural constraints.
I had an evolutionary question. Go ahead.
Well, kind of following up on your question, which is, I was struck in the very beginning when you had the slide where you were talking about the forces of the flight, and you had the peregrine falcon and the gervifalcon, and you had a barn swallow and the hummingbird, but you didn't have a swift. And of course, swifts probably have some of they're the size of the hummingbird. They have tremendous forces, and I'm curious if there are adaptations, since they're closely related. Are there adaptations that they both showed that would enable these forces to be produced during flight?
So there's some context I should add to that I didn't provide in the slide. Let's go back.
Do you know what the G's experienced by a peregrine is?
Oops, where did we go? Oh, right here. Here we go. So what I didn't mention, this is a diving peregrine falcon. The barn swallow, this is data from a paper in the late 90s where they were using radar to monitor migratory birds. And at the end of their migratory flight, a lot of these birds were entering into a steep dive, nearly vertical. That's where and so the barn swallow that went the fastest was an individual that went 50 meters per second in this dive. So this is not.
Swifts probably do that every day,
They could very well, but if there's data on it, I couldn't find the paper. So one issue that comes up is, could this simply be an allometric effect? Because of course Anna's hummingbird is smaller than the barn swallow or the peregrine falcon. When I originally submitted this paper, I had not realized it, but one of the reviewers pointed out that if you have a simple null model, the null model is basically about how the drag coefficient of the body should scale with size. And I'm now forgetting what the details of the math, but basically the prediction was that there should be a similar length-specific speed for birds of any size. That this by itself should not be just an artifact of allometry, whereas the accelerations, certainly there is an allometric component to it. At the same time, this number is not that much bigger than that. I do imagine swifts could be right in there, or even possibly higher, if they get flying fast enough and do some sort of dive.
But there's no special, we know that they're related, but are there specializations of the keel, of the muscles, detachments, and are there specializations that enable those high forces to be exerted?
Okay, so as far as the forces go, the example of what the pectoralis muscle forces were, in flight biomechanics, we are still have a pretty crude or rough understanding of how the flight muscles produce force at all, let alone what are the subtle adaptations for high force that they have. One thing that can happen is that the pronation angle of muscles can vary, and that's one variable that animals use to increase force or increase power at the cost of what is the total the contraction distance that the muscles can undergo. I know that hummingbirds have a really complex pronation pattern in their muscles. I know people in Doug Altshuler's lab have attempted to do things like get an average pronation angle, and so far they've had a hard time of it because the muscle is so complicated. So I guess the short answer is that I don't think we know enough about how the muscles produce force to know if there are adaptations shared between swifts and hummingbirds.
say that there's, and you pointed out in one of your graphs, that there's a critical airspeed.
Yes.
That suddenly will produce this aeroacoustic flutter.
Aeroelastic flutter, yes.
Okay. So how did something like that arise? It couldn't be gradual because there would be no sound production whatever until the animal got up to the point where its feathers would start oscillating at that at that particular frequency.
Yeah.
So would you visualize this as being sort of a macro mutation that would be a one-shot thing that would, what sort of a model would you?
Okay, so it's more complicated than I made it out to be in the talk, and there are several independent variables that all contribute to flutter. So U star, this critical velocity, is, if we're thinking of that as the dependent variable, it's a function of the stiffness of the feather, the shape of the feather, and both of those, we could have talked about the distribution of stiffness, so that's several variables in one. It's a function of the angle of the feather, both in terms of the angle of attack and also the sweep angle. And finally, it's also a function of neighboring feathers. So anytime when you have two feathers overlapping each other, this feather can't flutter freely because it has its neighbor behind it that's touching it or over it. And so when birds are flapping their wings, all of these variables are changing dynamically of what is the overlap between neighboring feathers, what's the airspeed over the feather, and so on. And so this has been a problem for my experiments. I've had a hard time, fully painting the parameter space of all these variables. Instead, I've just done a bunch of my experiments qualitatively. What I think happens is that for example, you get, well, and I guess the final thing, airspeed is definitely important. As we were mentioning earlier, these feathers have multiple modes of vibration. Each one will have its own critical velocity. And so the way that I'm thinking about how these sounds evolve in the first place is that you have a bird that's, has evolved a certain feather morphology for flight. The sound is likely to be produced when there's separation between the wingtips, which is often when there are high forces on the wings. It's also likely to be produced in high-speed flight, and so that's where we would tend to see these passive sounds arising initially. But that really, because they can play around with all these variables, that basically I'm imagining the origin of these sounds being the first bird that flew fast had some chance of making tonal sounds with its feathers. I'm not sure if did I answer your question, or
It's
sort of?
hypothesis, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Do you see any evidence from either difference between the beginning of the breeding season and end, or anything that this is at all learned, or is this completely innate from day one of a breeding season? Males can fly up and
Okay.
perfectly execute this.
So they do not perfectly execute the dives or displays from day one, from what I can tell. You do see hatchier birds doing displays with funny kinematics. Anna's hummingbird, for example, you'll see a hatchier bird go up 10 meters and dive, and then go up like 50 meters and dive. And so I do think that there's psychomotor learning involved. Just like learning to walk, there's learning involved in executing the behavior. I don't think there's social learning, that individuals are learning the dives or displays from other individuals. And the evidence for that comes mainly from hybrids. There's several hybrid pairs between different species in this clade that are described. If you have a hybrid and they're learning the displays socially, you would expect the hybrid to copy the displays of one parent species or the other. Instead, what happens in these hybrids is that you tend to get a mosaic of the two parent species behaviors. And so so in other words, I do think there's practice, I do think it's learning, but I think it's psychomotor learning, and I don't think they're learning these behaviors by watching other individuals and picking them up socially. Did that answer your question? Okay.
So my question,
Sorry.
okay, my question is regarding that other kind of display, I think called
The shuttle.
Yeah. So there in the video, you had the female inside the cage, and she also seemed to respond in some way to the male.
Yes.
So I have a two-part question. One is, how long does that go on for typically? And second, does the male's behavior change based on the decisions regarding, shifting between those two types of movements, where they kind of erratically did the other type of, alternative?
Yeah. So the displays sometimes are pretty brief, and other times can be pretty long. I think the maximum I had was one species, the Peruvian sheartail. Males would display for like half an hour. I mean, basically, my camera, the battery would be dead, the hard drive would be full, the sound recorder, it's like, I don't think I need any more sounds from this male. And that would be the point where I'd then throw a blanket over the cage or something like that to stop the male from responding to the female. Most of these species are not like that. Most of them, the displays are pretty short, and males rapidly acclimate to the stimulus of a female in a cage and then stop responding to it. It's putting a female in a cage on a male's territory is definitely unnatural, and I think what happens is that in these displays, naturally the male is relying on cues from the female to know to keep going or not, and that when we take a female in a cage and put that on the territory, that she's not giving the normal cues that she would be. I mean, you do see males displaying to females where the female clearly is not interested. She'll often have her tail spread and will be scolding the male and even will fly at and try to attack the male. In the cage, the females will try to do that through the walls of the cage, but of course they can't because there's a wall in the way. And so males will respond to that to some degree. Yeah, so I guess the long and the short of it is that I think there are a lot of dynamic behavioral interactions between male and female during these displays. And I only poorly and imperfectly capture them in the stuff that I'm doing here because the stimulus of a female in a cage is unnatural and her behavior is not normal. So.
Well, thanks, Chris.
Yeah.